They packed my whole life into 4 cardboard boxes and told me it was for my own good. My own son stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd fed him breakfast for 18 years, and he couldn't even look me in the eye when he said the words assisted living. 3 weeks later, I sat across from a lawyer, and my children's faces went white as paper. If you want to see exactly what happens when you underestimate a 77-year-old woman, stay until the end because I promise you it's worth it. Before I tell you what I did, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because these stories only get better from here, and I don't want you to miss the next one. Alright, let's begin. My name is Mary. I'm 77 years old, and until 3 months ago, I lived alone in the house my late husband Walter and I bought in 1974. For bedrooms, a garden out back where I grew tomatoes every summer, and a porch swing that Walter built with his own hands the year our first grandchild was born. That house held 49 years of my life. Birthdays, funerals, Christmas mornings, the quiet Tuesday afternoons after Walter passed when the silence in the rooms felt like its own kind of company. I have 2 children. My son Michael is 51. My daughter Diane is 48. I raised them both on my own for the last stretch after Walter got sick, and I never once complained because that's what mothers do. You give, and you tell yourself it doesn't matter whether anyone notices because love isn't supposed to keep score. But apparently somewhere along the way my children started keeping score. And I was losing. It started small. Michael would call less. Diane would visit on holidays only, and even then, she'd check her phone the whole time like she had somewhere better to be. I told myself it was just life, the way grown children get busy, the way distance creeps in without anyone meaning it to. I made excuses for them the way mothers always do. Then, about 4 months ago, I had a fall in my garden. Nothing serious, a sprained wrist, a bruise on my hip, but enough to send me to the emergency room. And that's when I watched my children's true colors bloom right in front of me, like a flower you didn't know was poisonous until it opened. Within a week, Michael and Diane were sitting in my living room with a folder. An actual folder, tabbed and organized, with brochures for something called Sunset Meadows Senior Living. They talked about my safety and my quality of life, and how they just wanted what's best for me. But I've lived 77 years on this earth, and I know the difference between concern and convenience. What they actually wanted was my house. You see, my house sits on nearly 2 acres in a neighborhood that developers have been circling like vultures for the past 2 years. A man from a construction company had already knocked on my door twice, asking if I'd ever consider selling. I said no both times. But somewhere between my hospital bed and my living room, my children had done their own math, and the number they landed on was bigger than whatever affection they still had for their mother. I found out later that Michael had already spoken to a realtor. Before he ever mentioned assisted living to my face, he had already priced my home. Diane, for her part, had been the one to actually tour Sunset Meadows and pick out the room. Not because she thought it would make me happy, because it was the cheapest option that would get me out of that house the fastest. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I wasn't confused. I wasn't losing my memory. My wrist was sprained, not my mind. But when your own children stand in front of you and tell you gently, sweetly, that this is what's best, you start to doubt yourself. That's the cruelest part of it. They don't just take your home. They try to take your certainty too. I let them move me. I want you to understand why, because I need you to know this wasn't weakness. It was patience. I signed the papers. I let them pack those 4 boxes. I let them drive me to Sunset Meadows on a gray Tuesday morning in March. And I said very little the whole ride. Michael filled the silence with cheerful nonsense about how nice the facility looked, how I'd make friends, how it was temporary, just to get back on my feet. Diane didn't say much at all. She just kept glancing at her phone, probably already coordinating with the realtor about staging dates. What none of them knew was that 4 days before that drive, I had already met with a lawyer of my own. His name is Mr. Whitfield, and he had been my late husband's attorney for over 20 years before he retired the practice down to just a handful of longtime clients, myself included. I called him the same week my children brought over that folder. I told him everything. The fall. The folder. The realtor. The room they'd already picked out without asking me a single question about what I wanted. Mr. Whitfield listened, and then he asked me one simple question. He asked, "Mary, is this your decision? Or is this being decided for you?" And that question cracked something open in me because for the first time in months, someone was asking what I wanted instead of telling me what was best. I told him what I wanted. I wanted to know exactly what my children were planning to do with my house. I wanted to know if there was any truth to what I suspected, that this whole care home conversation had far less to do with my hip and far more to do with my property value. And I wanted, if my suspicions were correct, to make sure that no one could touch a single brick of that house without my full and explicit knowledge. So Mr. Whitfield got to work, and I went to Sunset Meadows and I played my part. For 3 weeks, I was the picture of a sweet, compliant old woman adjusting to her new life. I ate the bland dinners in the common room. I let the staff take my blood pressure twice a day. I smiled at the other residents and learned their names and even started a little book club on Thursday afternoons, because I've always believed that wherever you land, you might as well plant something there. But every evening, after the halls went quiet, I sat by the window with my phone and I called Mr. Whitfield. And every few days he had something new to tell me. He confirmed that Michael had, in fact, contacted a realtor 6 weeks before my fall, asking for an estimated valuation on my property in case my mother's situation changes. Those were his exact words in an email that the realtor, an honest woman who felt uneasy about the whole arrangement, happily forwarded along once Mr. Whitfield explained the circumstances to her. He confirmed that Diane had researched Sunset Meadows specifically because it was the least expensive facility in a 40-mile radius, despite the fact that I had more than enough savings, thanks to Walter's careful planning, to afford somewhere far nicer. The math only made sense if the plan was never for me to stay long. The plan was to sell the house quickly, split whatever remained after covering the very minimum for my care, and move on with their lives. And most damning of all, he found the paperwork. A power of attorney document, drafted by a lawyer neither of my children had ever mentioned to me, sitting quietly in Michael's email drafts folder, and signed, waiting. Waiting for the day I'd be tired enough, confused enough, or simply worn down enough to sign away control of my own affairs. They were planning to ask me to sign it during their next visit. The visit that was scheduled for exactly 3 weeks after I moved into Sunset Meadows. I remember sitting in that little room with the beige walls and the single window looking out over a parking lot, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not sadness. Not even anger, not really. I felt clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stop making excuses for people you love, and start seeing them exactly as they are. So when Michael and Diane walked into Sunset Meadows 3 weeks after moving me in, smiling their practiced, hopeful smiles, carrying that folder with the power of attorney tucked inside it, I was ready. I didn't do it in my little room. I asked them to meet me in the facility's small conference room instead, the one families use for care planning meetings. I told them I had something important to discuss, and I watched their faces light up, because they assumed I was finally ready to sign. When we walked in, Mr. Whitfield was already seated at the table. I wish I could bottle the look on their faces in that moment, and play it back every single day for the rest of my life. Michael's mouth actually fell open. Diane's hand, the one holding that folder, started to shake. Mr. Whitfield didn't waste time on pleasantries. He laid out everything calmly the way a good lawyer does. The realtor contact firm before my fall. The choice of the cheapest facility despite my financial means. The unsigned power of attorney sitting in an email draft, ready to be printed the moment I let my guard down. I watched my children try to explain themselves, and I want you to know their explanations were not apologies. They were excuses dressed up as concern. Michael kept saying, "You don't understand the whole picture, Mom," as if there was some version of this story where contacting a realtor before your mother even falls ill somehow means something other than what it plainly means. Diane cried, but even through her tears, she never once said the words "I'm sorry." She said we were trying to help. Not the same thing. Not even close. Then I told them what I had decided. I told them that the house Walter and I built our lives in was no longer something either of them would ever have a claim to, because I had already restructured my entire estate. Mr. Whitfield had spent those 3 weeks not just gathering evidence, but drafting an entirely new will and an ironclad trust. The house, along with the bulk of my savings, was going into a trust that would fund scholarships in Walter's name at the community college where he taught night classes for 22 years. My children would still be named, but as far smaller beneficiaries than they'd ever imagined, and with clear conditions attached regarding honesty and involvement, conditions I would be reviewing personally every single year for as long as I was alive to do it. I also told them I was moving out of Sunset Meadows, not into their homes, into my own house, the one they thought they'd already claimed in their minds. I hired a wonderful part-time caregiver, a warm, capable woman named Priscilla, who checks on me 3 times a week and calls if anything seems off. I did not need a facility. I needed people who actually gave a damn about how safe or how happy I was, and it turned out I could hire that far more honestly than my own children had offered it. The last thing I said to them in that conference room was this. I told them that I forgave them, because carrying hatred at 77 years old is a heavier weight than I care to bear. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it certainly doesn't mean handing back the keys to a life they'd already tried to auction off behind my back. Michael tried calling me every day for the first 2 weeks after that meeting. I let most of those calls go to voicemail. Diane sent a long text message, the kind that starts with "I know you're upset," but which is never, in the history of the English language, followed by a genuine apology. I read it once and set the phone down. It's been about 2 months now since that day in the conference room. I'm back in my house. My tomatoes are coming in early this year, better than they have in a decade if I'm honest. Priscilla and I have tea on the porch swing most afternoons, the one Walter built, and some days I tell her stories about him, and some days we just sit quietly and watch the birds fight over the feeder. Michael reached out again last week, asking if we could talk things through. I told him I'd consider it, once he could look me in the eye and admit exactly what he did, without a single but attached to it. I haven't heard back yet. Diane hasn't reached out at all. I don't know if my children and I will ever fully repair what broke in that living room the day they showed me that folder. Maybe we will. Grief and anger have strange timelines, and I've learned at my age that people can surprise you, in both directions. But I know this much for certain. I am not the frail, foolish old woman they assumed they could quietly move out of the way. I built a life with my husband for 49 years in that house, and no folder, no realtor, no unsigned piece of paper was ever going to take it from me without a fight. If there is one thing I want any of you watching this to take away from my story, it's this. Age does not erase your intelligence. It does not erase your right to be heard, to be respected, or to make your own decisions about your own life. If people you love, even your own children, ever try to make choices for you under the guise of what's best, ask yourself who actually benefits from that choice. Sometimes the answer will break your heart. But knowing the truth, even a painful truth, is always better than living comfortably inside someone else's lie. Thank you for listening to my story today. If it meant something to you, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me what you would have done in my position. I read every single one, and honestly, some days your words keep me going more than you know. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and never let anyone convince you that you're too old to fight for what's yours.